So our speaker today, Peter Giddings. Born in Eastbourne, England, Peter is a resident of Danville. Lives here in Danville, became interested in sports and competition cars in the late 1950s. And his first car, to put it loosely, was a 1932 BSA air-cooled three-wheeler, which he managed to qualify as a motorcycle combination because he did not have a driver's license. Graduating from the BSA to a Brooklands Riley 9, Peter then owned a succession of chain-driven 1920 Fraser Nashes, one of which he restored in the living room of his home. Over the years, Peter has rebuilt or supervised the restoration of a number of historic landmark racing cars, including the 1925 Lyon Grand Prix Bugatti, the Fraser Nash Union Special, several Alfa Romeo Monzas, two Talbot Lago Grand Prix cars, two dual supercharged 8-cylinder Alfa Romeo P3s, two Alfa Romeo 8C35s, a Bugatti Type 59, a Maserati 258, and a Maserati 8CM. Not just any 8CM. On Peter's first visit to Goodwood in 1958, his local racing circuit, he fell in love with the ex-Whitney Straight Prince Bearer 1934 Maserati 8CM, possibly the most significant single-seater Alfa Romeo of all time. Black and white photographs of the car adorned Peter's early scrapbooks, and little did he know that 40 years later, he would be one of the proud owners of that car. In fact, it was in the late 80s that I first met Peter when he owned that car. Louis Vuitton had started doing a concours at Rockefeller Center in October, and I was associated with the museum, and we were asked to bring two cars, and one of the cars I bought back then, I was very fortunate to bring, was actually the Corsica-bodied Bentley that sits over there. There was about 60 cars in the show, and 59 of us were armed with our Maguire's detail kits, polishing the cars. One person was armed with 5 gallons of racing fuel and a rear axle stand, and that was Peter, because he was going to fire that thing up at Rockefeller Center and drive it the way it was supposed to be driven. So that's Peter. In 1959, Peter began his racing adventures in a 1928 Fraser Nash. By 1961, he had qualified for full FIA international license. Over the years, Peter has raced numerous significant and historic race cars, and has now raced most of the Titan Grand Prix cars, including the Mercedes W125, Monza's Tipo C and Tipo C Alfa Romeos, Bugatti's Type 51, Type 35B, and Type 59, and the Maserati 8CM, at events throughout the USA, Europe, Mexico, Canada, Bahamas, Australia, and New Zealand. In 1985, Peter drove his Alfa Romeo Monza and his Scuderia Ferrari Alfa Romeo P3 to such good effect at the Monterey Historics that he won the coveted Phil Hill Trophy, which was presented to him personally by the great Juan Manuel Fangio. In addition, for winning more vintage historic events in his vintage Alfa Romeos than anyone else in the world, Peter was awarded the Italian Scuderia del Portello Trophy. Over the years, Peter has received many honors and awards. In 2010, he was awarded the Motorsportsman of the Year award by the Motorsports Press Association. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome the custodian of some of the great racing cars, Peter Giddings.
Guy sounds pretty interesting. I'd like to meet him one day. So rather than me drone on about the Delage, by the way, it's quite amusing. Everybody's been walking in saying, where is the Delage? Is it not here? The fact is, 1926, this car at 35 inches to the shoulder is so low that no one knew where it was. Just quickly, we mentioned Whitney Straight, and while I think about it, Whitney Straight said the only true color for a race car is black. And Whitney and Richard Seaman, who was also the owner of this car at one point, went to school together, they flew together, they were buddies. So when Seaman eventually acquired this wonderful car, he changed it from French racing blue to black. And in that color it remains. It's nice and menacing. I always wear a black suit and a black helmet and black goggles, and that usually gains me a place or two when other drivers see me in their rearview mirror. Anyway, rather than me droning on, which of course I am now, as is my wont, I thought it would be fun if the car could tell us its story. And so this is a very amateur effort. We're not up for an Emmy or an Oscar, so please excuse what we've put together. But I started my search looking around for a French lady who was born the same year as the Delage, 1926. Easier said than done. But I finally found such a lady who very sportingly, she's never done this before, she, off camera, talks about the car. So in order to put a DVD together, we have to come up with pictures and even possibly footage. Pretty difficult for 1926. So it was a good excuse, and I traveled around the world visiting various clubs and museums and so on, and have amassed a number of wonderful photographs, many of them old, many of them quite washed out, so please excuse some of the slides that come up. And in addition, I heard some rumors that Fox Movie Tone, who exist in name only, of course, in 1929, sent a crew out to Indianapolis in 1929, and not only did they shoot film, they shot audio. And after a lot of searching and hard work, we've been able to obtain that footage, and we'll play a little bit of it for you. Early film is stored in, I believe it's nitrate-based. We have photographers here that will be better able to advise, but what I do know is it's highly volatile. It has to be kept in a special solution in barrels. When it's removed and dried and it sees oxygen for the first time, it immediately starts to decompose. So we had to pay for some skilled people to quickly transfer the film onto, in fact, digitize it, and then onto my DVD. So we'll even get to see that. So without further ado, and I suggest that we cut at least the spot over the Delage, otherwise it will wash out this screen. We'll introduce you to this amazing car, which I have known about and followed since I was a lad.
What we'd like to do at this point in time is we're going to bring Peter back up here, and we start off the Q&A section with 6 questions that we ask each of our presenters. And then after that, we're going to open the floor up to questions that you may have. So Peter, would you like to join me up here? Maybe we can turn the background music down a little bit. And then after we've done this, after we've done the question and answer section, Peter's got some footage we're going to show. It's just a comparison of the pit stops from 1926 and the pit stops of 2014. It should be interesting to watch. Anyway, so Peter, what are your top 5 favorite cars of all time?
I can only have 5.
You can only have 5. You have a magical transporter that you can take around the world, and you can go back in time. And you could put 5 cars in this transporter.
Okay, so I'm into historic racing, as you know. So any version of a pre-war rear-engined auto union. I've driven raced every single 750 Formula car other than the auto union. So Audi, if you're listening. So that will be number one. I'm lucky enough to have campaigned a Mercedes W125, but it was a glorious experience, just like driving a modern Porsche. I brought it in after 2 laps complaining that the clutch was slipping, and the mechanic said, "You idiot, it's spinning its wheels in 5th gear." That's how powerful it was. Of course, the Delage would have to be one of the 5. An Alfa Romeo 1589, a glorious car, absolutely glorious car. My friend had 2 1589s in Australia one year when I was doing a support race in Adelaide. We were billeted in a Victorian bus garage, which was all glass, a bit like the Crystal Palace. We fired that 1589, and we broke just about every pane of glass in that building. And lastly, which really was a fond farewell to the great Jarno, who designed all of the 8-cylinder Alfas, as most of you know, a Lancia D50.
You thought that was difficult. So your transporter is heading across the continent, and it fails to proceed. And you have to go in the back and pull one car out. And you can't go back and change your mind. You have to choose one of those cars.
Okay, well, I guess given that the Auto Union is the last remaining 750 Formula car left on my bucket list, I would pull out the Auto Union.
I don't think I disagree with you. I was very fortunate to attend the Monaco Historic Races this year. And Audi had a C-Type and a D-Type doing laps of the Monaco circuit. Jackie Ickx behind the wheel, one of them. And I hope I never stop getting goosebumps when you hear cars like that. Next question. What car would you drive coast to coast? Whether a leisurely Route 66 or Cannonball Run style?
Well, I believe in racing only on racetracks. And so I'm fairly meek and mild driving on the street, with a few exceptions. I'm sure my wife will be waving a hand saying there have been exceptions. So I would take Route 66. I would load Lady Judy on board with me, who, by the way, is here and is a wonderful lady, putting up with all of this glorious foolishness. The most selfless person I've ever met. Thank you, Judy. And then in the back, we would load, you saw his picture up on the screen, Lord Havelock, our Great Dane, better known as Havoc, most appropriately. And I think if you'd be so kind, we would do it in the Corsica-bodied Bentley.
It's a sinister way going cross-country. If you could, which automotive personality from history would you like to meet, whether over lunch or to go for a drive with?
Okay, no hesitation there. Tazio Nuvolari, the greatest driver of all time, in my humble opinion. And that would involve a drive, either in a Monza or one of the short chassis 8C Alfas. Tazio attempted to fly when he was a young boy, jumping off the roof of his parents' home with a couple of wings attached. And, of course, he crashed. And his poor mother said, "He's a dear boy, but crazy." Nuvolari went on to be a champion skeet shooter. a champion downhill skier. He was a pilot. He was a bicycle racer. He excelled driving for Scuderia Ferrari, mainly on Rudge and Norton motorbikes. He was brilliant in front-engine cars. He invented the drift, or the slide, as it was known back then, and then went on to the rear-engined Auto Union, which he conquered. By the way, is George here? My friend George? Did he make it? Yes. All right, I'm going to talk about you in a moment, George, but lovely to see you. So that's why I would sit in with the great Tazio Nuvolari, and we have a nice segue into Nuvolari in a little while when I introduce all of you to my friend, and we're very privileged to have him, George Poniatke, and he'll tell us how to pronounce that better than I do. Sorry.
Next question. Which automotive venue or event would you wish to visit or attend?
Okay, again, pretty easy. The original Spa or the Nürburgring, again, in one of those wonderful auto unions.
And the final question. What is your most cherished automotive artifact and why?
When Judy and I emigrated to America, we met very early on. We lived on Long Island, the great René Dreyfus. At that time, with his brother, he was running Le Chanticleer, and he became almost like a father to us, and we spent many happy times with him. When he learned that I was going to acquire an early Maserati, he became very excited because he drove for Maserati at one point. They had no money to pay him, so they said, well, you can set up a dealership and we'll give you a Maserati 26B. And when he heard that I was getting a Maserati because he'd had such dismal success with the 26B, Maserati made brilliant cars, but they were a small family business. They didn't have a lot of money, and they were always experimenting, 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, V8. And so no car was really back then perfected. So anyway, when René was sick and going into hospital, and sadly he didn't survive the operation, the evening before, it's a little hard to tell you this, he wrote a note to Judy and I and autographed some photographs. That will be it.
All right. Now we're going to open up to questions from the floor. And if you can put your hand up if you're interested in asking a question. And I'm the only one with a microphone, so just give me a minute. Yeah.
I just wanted to know, Mr. Giddings, when did you race that last, or drive it last?
Yes, I debuted it in 2013 and finished on the podium. That was at Laguna Seca. Even with a broken finger follower. I had attempted to run it again this year, and I had another problem, and that really is it. So we're still getting to know each other.
Very good. And what's the top speed you could drive it today?
Yeah, the top speed is an interesting one. Those of you that have looked at the car will see many novel features, amazing for 1926, one of which is a 5-speed gearbox. And the fifth gear is an overdrive. And so the speed in the indirect gears, fourth being top, is 108 miles an hour. And then on fifth overdrive at 8,000 RPM, 162 miles an hour in 1926.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, Peter, if Your house is on fire, and you can take one thing out which is not living. What is it?
Robert, I recognize your voice, and that's a wicked question. My wife, of course. Not living. Well, my wife is very much living. Yes, I mean, I have many, many great cars. This is my latest love. I met Ramponi when I was a young man. My mum took me up to London to meet him. Then he was in business with Billy Rockall and had a small Muse garage close to Hyde Park Corner. And he'd built a sort of a crude wooden mezzanine above the garage door, and we climbed up those steps, and he sat behind his desk, which was cluttered with connecting rods and technical data and so on. And he held up a round disc, which I meant to have to show you because I have it. He reached over his back and took this round disc and put it on the desk, and he said, "Do you know what this is, son?" And I didn't. I said, "I have no idea." And it was a degree wheel, and he told me how he had spent literally days timing each of the 8 valves of the Delage, and then the engine, as you saw on the DVD, was then taken down to the dyno facility. And he was just so proud, even then, all of those years later. This would have been in the mid to late 50s. He was so proud of the fact that he got more power out of the engine than Maestro Lori even got. So I would probably drag out the Delage, particularly as, don't forget, in 1926, this Delage roasted the feet of the poor drivers. Some people say that those buckets were not full of cold water, they were full of champagne. But a gentleman who was actually there told me that the boots and the feet, when they put in the water, literally sizzled. That's how hot it was. So that was its first experience with extreme heat. And then, of course, that fateful day at Rob Walker's, where the car so nearly perished. So that's what I would take out, Robert.
Peter, did the Grand Prix program of Delage did it contribute to his bankruptcy, as I have heard?
Yes. I mean, perhaps he was a little foolish when he said to Albert Lorry, a 32-year-old genius, a chain-smoking genius, expense is no object. Lorry took him at his word. As the DVD told us, there isn't a single plain bearing in this engine. It's a Swiss watch. It has over 70 crowded ball, roller, and needle bearings. And the cost at the time to produce the 4 cars, the prototype, which is with Collier, and the other 3 cars, of which this is really the sole survivor, cost, even back then, millions. And as again we told you in the DVD, he being Louis Delage, had branched into aircraft engine design, but had not done well. The government didn't pick up on any of his designs. And his boulevard car sales, his street car sales were dwindling. And so he was essentially bankrupt. He died, by the way, a pauper. There's a story of him ragged and ill, walking with a stick, looking through the window of the Delage and Delage showroom, and someone recognizing him and saying, "Aren't you Louis Delage?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And he was invited in, but he wouldn't go in, and he shuffled away. So a sad end, because in his day, the wild and crazy parties that he held in his chateau and his 4 jewels that he commissioned, they were wonderful and exciting times for him. Benoit, by the way, who predominantly drove this car, when Chiron went to the factory, he said to Laurie, well, which car should I take? And Laurie said, take the Benoit winning car. It's the best. So that's one of the reasons why we know the complete history, the storied history of this car. But anyway, Benoit, he was that very handsome man that we saw on one of the slides with the square lantern jaw. He subsequently went into the French resistance, was captured twice and escaped. And the third time he went back in, the third time he was caught again, and he was garroted. So a great hero, Legion of Honor, who met with a very sad end.
Any other questions from anybody? Ah.
These are probably the longest answers you've ever had.
Peter, in one of the detailed shots of the engines, it looks like there was an airfoil mounted on the car. Did it ever run with the airfoil?
Yes, it did. It was truly aerofoil in section, which would have been a first. And it was placed on the driver's side. You'll see the hardware there. And it was very clever because it was to stop the rain and mud being thrown up over the face of the Delage. But I think quite brilliant that rather than just putting a flat plate for avoiding mud and rain, as for example my 250F Maserati has, which was designed and built in 1953, that in 1926 Laurie said, well, this needs to cheat the air, we'll give it a true aerofoil section. Good question.
Peter, based upon your history and preservation of this great technology, what modern-day supercar would you have hold in the highest respect, and why?
Goodness. Well, the Bugatti Veyron, or latest version of same, is an amazing vehicle, of course. I think a slightly more practical vehicle and beautifully designed and very fast would be the McLaren. I like some of the Audi supercars and the cars that Audi is designing and has run at Le Mans, but they're not street vehicles per se. But I'm kind of locked into the past, so that's about the best I can do for you insofar as a modern car is concerned.
We'll take one more question and then we'll show the video if we have one more question.
Yes, I would like to know what's it actually like to drive around at Laguna Seca on the track.
Yes, a good question. The lady who was my Delage spoke about her whippy chassis. A mechanic in the day who worked on this car described it as a dachshund. And the reason he called it a dachshund was that the chassis was so whippy and loose. If you afterwards look at the car, there is a wafer-thin carrier for the front of the engine, which does nothing. And then you go all the way back, it's a very, very long engine, to the gearbox until you get to any chassis stiffening. Suffice to say that when you jack up any one wheel on this car, the other three remain firmly on the ground. So Lawrence Pomeroy, who some of you may have heard of, who did an assessment of this car and, needless to say, loved it, suggested that perhaps the whippy chassis discounted or almost completely discounted the wondrous quality of the engine. So driving around Laguna Seca, if you stay away from the berms, And most of the modern tracks we run these days are as smooth as a baby's bottom. We have to remember that in the day, these cars ran on very bad surfaces indeed. It's quite delightful. It's only 1.5 liters. It doesn't have the torque of my Alfas, so it's a bit like a Formula Ford. Forgive me for saying that, but I mean you have to stay on the cam. Nothing much happens until you get about 5,500 revs. So the 5-speed gearbox is very handy. You have to stay busy and keep it on the cam. It's a long car, so it seems to take about half an hour to get around any corner before you're completely around it. But it's delightful, and as I said earlier, we're still getting to know each other. Many of my cars I've owned and raced for more than 30 years, and we know each other very well. We're still in our honeymoon stage with this car.
Actually, before we show the video, Peter, you wanted to...
Yeah, I just... George, could you please just stand up for a moment, please? I want to introduce the audience to my friend George, who has come... who's come a long way. George, I always struggle with your surname. Would you please pronounce your surname for us? Your second name. Okay, it sounds very different when you say it. George is a very special person, and if we have any members of the press here, you better latch onto this guy. And Tim, you might even want to think about him as a guest speaker. Believe it or not, George, growing up with cars, including Tatra Streamliners and Adlers and Ostradamlers and the like, actually went to Grand Prix races in the 30s. So this man, who is still with us and as bright as a button, saw and heard and witnessed Mercedes, Auto Union, Alfa Romeo, Maserati, Delage, drivers such as Stuck, Haas, Von Delius, Caricciola, Brauschwitz, Fagiola, Nuvolari. So one of few still with us that can tell us about those days. And in fact, interestingly enough, he was there one day when Hans Stuck honored Nuvolari and invited Nuvolari to not only sit in the Auto Union, the car that I lust after, but to drive it, which Nuvolari did in a training session. And that was at the Ring in 36 or 37. And suffice to say that Nuvolari very quickly matched the lap times of all of the then works driver. And it was very shortly after that that Nuvolari switched from Auto Union, switched from Alfa, the Tipo C, like the car I have, to the Auto Union. Also a pilot. George flew Messerschmitts, the 109 and the 262. So he goes from propeller age to jet. He's also raced and is a BMW enthusiast. So there are lots of special friends and people here, but I did just want to single out George because he's a very special person.
So now we're going to show the pit stop comparison over the decades.
Yes, if we've got time, I don't know, throw me out when you want to. Let me describe the pit stop. It's a Miller, and there are two mechanics. The tall one I call Igor. He wasn't at all keen to be filmed. The only reason he was chosen was that he's extremely good and strong with a knockoff hammer. except that he doesn't know which way round the knockoffs come off. And his little friend, sorry, did you hear that? I guess you did. And his little friend, you'll note that Igor attempts to mount the wire wheel on backwards. There are several takes where the miller literally runs over the mechanics because the miller doesn't stop in time. And I just think it's a wonderful comparison with the, 4-second four-wheel and tire changes that the likes of Mercedes and Red Bull do these days. And then if we have time, I have some footage of our first ever test running for the first time in some 60 years of the Delage, where you can hear its amazing roar. Okay?
How's that housing line up there, Jack? Why, not too good, I don't believe. I think we'll have to take...
This is all wonderful, but perhaps you'd like to hear the sound of the Delage engine. So this is at Ruapuna in New Zealand. Except that we don't have the sound. That's probably enough. That's probably enough. So, Rob Walker said that the V16 BRM, any of the pre-war Alphas, and the post-war, or still pre-war as a 158 Alfa Romeo, and the Delage were the best-sounding cars, in his opinion, in the world. And we all enjoy listening to that very lusty 1.5-liter engine.
Peter, thank you very much. Everybody put your hands together again for Peter Giddings.